And the trend of all our viral clips being something that I wouldn't have guessed would feature on our channels in 100 years continues, Simon commented. The orange-haired young man sat in front of a laptop with 2 extra screens attached in a quite broad setup that he had constructed in his cabin on the warship Civil. He used it to check over the analytics from an almost staggering amount of social media sites, some of which James hadn't even remotely heard of before. I guess at least this time I knew this would blow up the moment I got it on camera. Yeah, a formerly very respected councilman going totally off his rocker and demanding that someone try to eat him on the open street. That'll get people talking, Admit confirmed with a nod, while leaning over the younger man's shoulder to check over some stuff himself, with previously acquired permission. I'm almost disappointed that I missed that. Simon exhaled slowly. It really wasn't as fun as it sounds, he said, and shook his head a bit before wiping some hair away from his face. Then he lifted his gaze up to the officer. Do you think this will cause any problems? There are the clips everywhere now, I mean. Admir blew some air out through hollow cheeks and lifted a hand to run his fingers over his clean-shaven chin. I mean, any sane person is going to see that this guy's lost a few too many of his marbles, but I guess this will be a good indicator about the galaxy's current supply of sanity, he finally assessed. I can see some of the less put-together folks out there try to use this as some sort of martyr figure, especially with how long the old croaker has been around. But outside of that, it should be fine. Don't worry too much. He then lifted his gaze away from the screens and turned his head to look behind himself, where James was somewhere off in his own little world with an unreadable, glum expression on his face. At least we are most definitely winning the war on optics, Admit commented, just loud and directed enough to pull James out of his thoughts, and he deliberately pretended to be checking him out for a moment. James rolled his eyes a bit. He knew that the whole sex appeal angle of the campaigning that Admit kept bringing up was mostly meant as a joke to keep the mood light, even if some of those threads actually gained a decent bit more attention than James had expected, to the point that he didn't know if he was entirely comfortable with it. Granted, they were all just pictures that had been on the net for ages anyway, so it wasn't like people couldn't have gone and found them on their own. But still. He quickly shook the thought away. He really had bigger things to worry about than whether people were looking a bit too closely at old vacation pictures of him. As he was still in the motion, his phone suddenly began to buzz in his pocket, causing him to jump slightly at the sudden vibration. He didn't get many calls at the moment because he had set the device up in such a way that only a very few choice callers would actually be put through to him, while the bulk of other people attempting contact would be redirected to a few trusted advisors back on Earth, who could handle possible political negotiations for him. He excused himself with a lifted hand as he dug his phone out of his pocket and turned to walk a few steps away in order to take the call. In a single glance, he immediately recognized the number, and his lips lifted into a much-needed smile as he picked up. You called just in time, Cury. I can use some sanity in my life right now, he greeted into the phone, while still taking a few more steps to the side. On that note, how did your hearing go? Hello, James, Cury's artificial voice replied soon enough, sounding neutral as always, and still carrying a familiar warmth with it, though admittedly that might have just been caused by James's own thoughts and feelings here. The hearing went rather well, I would imagine. Dr. Duarte appeared quite amused by the idea that live recordings of ongoing inaugurations were entered into evidence in real time, right after they happened. Although I admittedly found it hard to read the judge's feelings on the matter. Still, it was hard for anyone to deny that a cyborg at least momentarily held the highest position the galaxy has to offer, so assuming insanity simply based on augmentation alone became quite a bit harder. And I believe my representation did quite a splendid job arguing my case when it came to accusations of self-harm or suicidality. Well, that woman is a pro. I would hope she knows what she's doing, considering how much she likely bills her hour, James replied in relieved amusement. Although it wasn't prominent in his mind, a small part of him had dreaded the thought of Cury telling him everything had suddenly gone to hell in the courtroom. Do they give you any idea of when a decision will be made? Cury paused for a moment before they replied, The judge said they have all the facts needed to make a decision now, and has therefore withdrawn for deliberation. According to Dr. Duarte, that could both be a very good or a very bad sign generally, but she is optimistic, they finally explained. She says either way, the verdict will be announced soon. James nodded to himself as he listened. It was typical that things came down to a could be good, could be bad situation. But he wasn't the law expert here, so if the doctor said that she was optimistic, he would try to be as well. And your parents? He wondered, not quite able to suppress the question. It may have been due to recent mending in his own family, but he couldn't quite help but ask. There was an element of similarity, after all, even if his own mother never reached the same level of cruelty even during her worst days. I have not spoken to them, Cury replied directly. All contact since your departure is taking place for our legal representation. There was a finality to that statement, one that James more than respected. Probably better that way, he said, in a tone that mirrored said finality. Then he suddenly realized that he had sort of taken over this conversation inadvertently, and he cleared his throat. Oh, sorry, I kind of walked away with this, I think. Did you just want to chat and give me an update, or was there another reason for your call? At that, Cury's voice box released an unsure sound that was pretty hard to define in its nature, but was most certainly intended to fill some empty air while the cyborg tried their best to order their thoughts on the matter, which already made James listen up, as he wondered what could possibly have his friend so hesitant about telling him. I was asked to please contact you as one of the few people who probably could without question, they finally informed him in a matter-of-fact way. James lifted an eyebrow as he wondered who could have requested that sort of thing of the cyborg. Someone from Reason? Probably not. They likely had proper channels. Maybe one of Moore's kids? No. They would have called her directly, even if they wanted to reach him. Okay, sure, he finally said, figuring it was senseless to wonder when he could just ask. You've got a message or something? I do, Cury replied right away this time, though they hesitated again right after. Just please keep in mind that I am only the messenger. James's brow furrowed a bit. That was an odd thing to specify. Yeah, of course, he replied anyway, confident that Cury wouldn't ever purposely try to upset him in any way. Just give it to me straight. Cury took a moment to gather themselves. That probably would have been filled with a deep inhale if they still had normal lungs. It is Reprieg. He has requested to speak to you and HFY, they finally stated in a sober manner. He was quite patient and polite about his request, so I was inclined to at least inform you of it. I will make no judgment on whether you should actually follow the request. James needed a second to process that, though it really was just a second. I'll talk to her and see what she says, he then quickly confirmed for the cyborg. Did he tell you if I can still reach him through the same number? He did say you would know how to reach him, Cury confirmed in return. All right, good, James said, with another nod to himself. With that, the topic was over for him for the time being. He released a bit of a huffing breath before lifting his voice up a bit as he went on. So, how have things been for you otherwise? If you've got the time for it, I've got a lot to tell you. Have you been following the news recently? In the meantime, huddled around a decently sized, but thankfully not absolutely massive table, a meeting of the more obligate carnivores of the group had come together to enjoy a meal of non-cloned meat. Given recent events, Konglorch and Tharavel had decided to opt out of the shared dinner, meaning that the group for once consisted of relatively evenly sized predators, even if the present Miat still had a good couple of inches on even the taller of the two Laxashet. As they ate, Givianora couldn't quite help herself, as her eyes constantly darted over to Ajaxia's replacement eye. But at least it seemed like, despite her not exactly polite glances, the presence of the augmented Volpine didn't exactly hinder her appetite. Sheeda, on the other hand, constantly wondered if it wasn't just a little bit morbid that she had agreed to the serving of roasted Chifian as dinner, even if she had been craving it for a very long while at this point, after not having a chance to get it in ages. Granted, James himself has said that it was totally fine, especially since it wasn't unheard of for humans to eat other primates as well, at least in the past. But she still couldn't quite help but let her thoughts drift in the oddest directions, especially since the roasted and by now half-skeletonized carcass sitting in the middle of the table was of a somewhat similar size, form and build to at least one of their current allies. Maybe she was just letting Kashalengas's insane ramblings get to her head. Still, she noted it down in the back of her mind that they maybe shouldn't tell Losarana too much about tonight's meal, just to be safe. It was around that time that Girionora seemingly couldn't keep to herself anymore. Lifting her hand to gesture vaguely at her own eye, she began to ask, "So, is it cool to ask about—" "No," Ajaxia interrupted her, before the question was even fully finished. Her tone was polite and somewhat meek, but it definitely carried a clear message despite that. Girionora immediately lifted her hand into a flat, disarming gesture. "Okay," she conceded, unwilling to cause an argument over dinner, likely also because her boss was present. However, her eyes then briefly swung over to the other Vulpine, and one of her ears began to twitch slightly. "What about you?" she asked Levexar directly, her hand once again turning to now motion vaguely at her neck. Levexar's large ears turned to follow the conversation, though his stiff, solid green eyes remained affixed to his food, as he simply gave a very light nod in Sheeta's direction. "Got them from her," he informed, which admittedly caused Sheeta to ever so slightly sink into herself. Although she didn't exactly regret what she had done, since she had only acted on what she knew at the time, and the man held a gun to her face back then, she wasn't exactly proud of it either. "Was a long time ago." Girionora's eyes widened a bit. "Huh," she commented, seemingly not quite sure what to say to that. However, her tail began to swish in an interested manner as her gaze cheekily crept over to Sheeta. "That is quite the coincidence," Zishidi confirmed. Despite having appeared somewhat disinterested so far, it seemed like the man had still been paying attention to the ongoing conversation. Levexar just shrugged, his own bushy tail giving a single wag from one side to another. "Coincidence is one way to put it. In the end, events have a way of connecting together," he stated, in a way that made it seem like the simple sentence was scratching the very surface of some sort of deeper philosophy. "We are both connected to the same conflict. Back then we were on opposing sides, now we are on the same. Our paths could have very well crossed again one way or another as long as they remained attached to that central lead. This is one of the more pleasant outcomes." Zishidi released a somewhat amused sound at the man's philosophical prattle. However, what he said kicked something loose in Sheeta's mind. Not exactly the philosophical part, though that was interesting to think about as well. No, something far more material suddenly came to her, after it had sort of sat in a dark back corner of her brain for a long while. "Now that you mention it," she said, wanting to bring it up immediately before the topic could change and she would possibly simply push it out of her mind again, "I don't think I've ever asked you what actually was in those briefcases back then." At that, Levexar finally lifted his face away from his food and turned his head so his locked gaze could look at her. "Huh, I guess you didn't," he confirmed in a way that indicated he, too, had somehow completely disregarded that part. "Briefcases?" Girionora tried to chime in, but Sheeta quickly lifted her hand. "I'll explain in a minute," she assured, but kept her gaze affixed to the Lakshasette. Levexar took a moment to pick up a napkin and clean around his mouth before sighing. "I'm afraid I can't tell you too much," he then finally said, as he put the napkin back down. "We followed those shady warrant officers for a while back then, but all we really managed to find out is that they most likely communicated their more unsavory orders through those briefcases. I mean, I guess you probably guessed that part at this point. Since I never managed to get my hands on it, I have no idea what was in that specific one. And apparently they stopped using that way of communication while I was in the hospital, and subsequently locked up." He tilted his head to look down for a moment. Whatever method they've been using since then is a lot more subtle, he mumbled, indicating that they weren't quite sure with what exact method the orders were communicated these days. If she'd had to guess, it was probably something digital now. Levexar's head then perked up a bit, as another thought seemed to enter his mind. Amazing that guy's a candidate now, isn't it? He mentioned, while seeking eye contact with Sheeta again. The feline in return released a mild hiss that was cut apart by her sharp teeth and eventually turned into a scoff. Ruktusma, I wouldn't want that guy anywhere near a leading position, even if he wasn't some murderous shadow government lackey, she informed, not returning the man's eye contact for the time being. Instead, she used her fork to push a small bone back and forth on her plate to give her hands and eyes something to do. He wasn't exactly a great boss, and judging from what I have seen during the Council of Primates, he hasn't gotten any better since then. Although she had mostly brought it up to denigrate the man who had very briefly been her superior in the past, the mere mention of it suddenly caused a whole host of feelings to bubble up from within her. For a brief moment, she was afraid that her thoughts would automatically drift to the other primate authority figure from back then, and bring that insatiable anger with them once again. However, instead, it was a completely different face. Or, well, non-face that appeared in front of her inner eye. A vision of geometric compound eyes, and a metallic purple exoskeleton. She really wondered what Now Zem was doing now. Their last interaction had been quite a long while ago, and it had left a truly odd impression on her. The division officer had been the cause of many headaches for her in the past, but now she wondered. Was she still in the military after all that? Did she still serve on the GES-32? Or has she moved on to new ventures after no longer agreeing with the way things had unfolded? Or had she moved on to new ventures after no longer agreeing with the way things had unfolded after Sheeta's departure? Was she even in good health? Suddenly, Sheeta's ears twitched and she snapped up, realizing that she had completely zoned out for a bit. Chirianora, who had apparently tried to get her attention, was looking at her with a lifted eyebrow that teetered between concerned and annoyed at being so thoroughly ignored. Everyone else also had a somewhat wondering expression on their faces, as Sheeta fully came back to reality. Obviously seeing it on her face that she was perceptive to the people around her once more, Chirianora spoke up in a deliberately slow manner to once again try and get an answer out of her. So, what about those briefcases? After recounting the events that had led to her and Levexar's first unfortunate meeting, which then in turn took the entire group down a rabbit hole that tried to piece together the steps of Ruktusma's career after he had dismissed Sheeta as his apprentice so outright, and which ultimately turned out with him as a candidate for councilman, the dinner had finally come to an end as the group dispersed again. Sheeta immediately took a shuttle back over to the Sun, not wasting any time before she crept into her and James's shared cabin. James still seemed to be out right now, leaving the room empty and silent apart from the usual hum of a working ship. With a lot of time once again spent on her feet, and her stomach well filled, there was certainly some allure to the idea of simply falling into bed right away to not fall behind on much-needed sleep once again. However, something stopped her from doing that immediately. Instead, her steps led her to her luggage, or at least the parts of it that she had never bothered unpacking. She easily pulled the large leather bag out of the corner she had banished it into, given that it was barely filled and therefore hardly weighed anything at the moment. She opened it and searched through it for only a moment, before her hands already latched on exactly what she was looking for. She didn't even need to look. The texture was so incredibly familiar that she would have been able to pick it out among millions of other items. Gently, she moved her hands around the bundle of fabric and lifted it out of the bag slowly. Soon enough, the white fabric with yellow accents along its outline came into view as it pushed past the edges of the bag. Inadvertently, her fingers rubbed along the slightly rough surface, the feeling instantly bringing her back to the countless times she had put on this uniform, or at least one of its kind. Her face couldn't quite decide if it wanted to smile or not, as she inspected the uniform and remembered how Nao Zam had given it to her during their last meeting. It was the last intact one she owned after she had shredded every other existing pair in a fit of rage after her escape from the GCS. Almost no one else in the entire fleet had worn uniforms, and certainly no one on her ship did. At least not until James came along. These had been made especially for her. Her eyes clung to the insignia embroidered onto the chest, which, along with the yellow accents, had once identified her as a ranking crew member. She could remember just how proud she once was of that. From there, her eyes wandered to her own arms, which carefully held the uniform suspended, and she inspected the near-true black sleeve of her new uniform. Faint white dots speckled it, alluding to the picture of a starry night sky. In design, it was almost the exact opposite of the galactic communal uniform. The uniform of the UHSDF wasn't one that had been made for her, of course. It had been around for a long time. It had been adapted to her specific body plan, but overall it was one of many. Her hands inadvertently clenched around her old uniform, causing the muscles in her arms to flex and push against her sleeves a bit. Seeing that, the thought entered her mind that these old uniforms probably wouldn't even fit her anymore. She had been so much thinner back then, even if it was hard to remember that. She had felt healthy back then, for the most part, and she didn't feel especially bulky now or anything. Overall, her general feeling of self hadn't changed that much since those days, at least as far as she could remember. But intellectually, she knew that if she was to put a picture of her from now and from then next to each other, the difference would likely have been like night and day. As she absentmindedly held onto the uniform a bit longer, she suddenly found herself in a position where she wasn't exactly sure what she even wanted to do with it now. The most sensible thing would have probably been to simply put it back into her bag and just leave it be. However, a small part of her almost felt the need to take it to bed with her. Then again, she didn't even want to imagine the kind of thoughts that would probably go through James's head should he arrive back to their room only to find her curled up or hugging her old uniform. That would be a conversation and a half. Still, in a way, this dumb piece of cloth somehow made her remember all the good parts of her early career, which were the parts she very rarely thought about these days. It was mostly just the bad stuff that was constantly on her mind, and made her way a little bit worse whenever it wormed its way into her awareness. But it hadn't all been bad. Sure, she wouldn't want to go back to it now, but she wouldn't have made it for as long as she did had it all been terrible all the time. Once again, her thoughts went to Nao Zam. Nao Zam, who had stepped up to be her mentor after Rook Tusma simply dropped her without another word, even after she had presumably saved his life, or at the very least his job. Nao Zam, who had been the one who had taught her most of the things she knew from that moment onward, all the way until they were forced to part ways. She had been strict. Yes, very strict. Infuriatingly so at times. However, there had never been a moment when she'd hadn't at least felt respected by her. Sure, she had gotten shitty tasks sometimes. Sure, she had gotten an earful whenever something didn't go the DO's way. But everyone had to deal with that, and she had never really felt singled out by her. Even as she was, as she now knew, held back and passed up for promotions time after time, she couldn't say that she felt like Nao Zam had ever held back with what she taught her. Her qualifications were all up to par with what would be expected from a career as long as hers, and basically all of it was taught to her by that same woman. She just had never really gotten the recognition for it. With that thought, it was obviously impossible not to think of that man who had been the one to deny her that exact recognition, even if she didn't know it at the time. However, to her own surprise, even as she thought about Uton and the way she trusted him back then, only to be constantly stifled in her progress behind her back, her usual indomitable wrath at the man just sort of skipped out that time. She was still angry, yes, even very angry, but it was a more controlled, reasonable anger. One that knew exactly what and who she was angry at and why, and that she had every right to be angry about it. She wasn't entirely sure just how and what had changed in order for the feeling that was previously only escapable through avoidance to suddenly just take the day off. However, as she looked down at the uniform again, she could only imagine that it had to have something to do with it. Probably more metaphorically than actually. She doubted the uniform itself had some physical effect on her brain. Still, the item did ultimately end up being pressed tightly against her chest, as she drifted off to the land of dreams.